Argosy, Volume 272, Number 3. Originally published April 17th, 1937. Graveyard of the Gods, by Donald Barr Chidsey. Kilipalaki stood 6 feet 4, but he didn't stand very steadily, being drunk as a huta. Kilipalaki was ordinarily a quiet giant, white-haired, ignorant, good-natured, an old-timer who would spear and throw net, wading alone, could catch more fish than any howl supposed existed. He'd been using the bay, and living in a shack out on the point, ever since anybody could remember. And although the land belonged to somebody else, it was generally understood that Kilipalaki had some sort of right to it. Anyway, nobody had ever tried to put him off, which was understandable, for he was built like Longfellow's village blacksmith with 40 or 50 pounds of muscle added. He swayed, blinking stupidly. Customarily a clam, he had been chattering without pause for the past 45 minutes. "Too much Okalahu," he muttered. "Miinu." "No kiddin'?" said Dave Costa. Kilipalaki shook his fine head. His eyes were glazed, unseeing. "Miinu, migo momo." Still dignified, in spite of everything, he staggered through the door, stumbled down the stairs, lurched a few yards across the lawn, and fell flat on his face, after which he did not move. "Out like a light," drawled Ed Dane. "Funny about that," Costa said. "That guy's never been known to be that way before, as far as I know. Never touches the stuff. I was afraid for a while there he might get rambunctious. Some of these quiet guys do when they're fried." Costa was tough enough, as local products go, but he wasn't in a class with that Dane. Dane was not only white, he was pale as chalk, a mainlander who scorned such things as sunbaths. The backs of his small hands were covered with coarse yellow hair, and his eyes were slate gray, and, like the hands, perfectly steady. He talked slowly, never raising his voice. He didn't move around much. "I didn't get a lot of that Kanaka talk," he said, "but it sounded interesting, as much as I could make out. Sounded like exactly what we need. Where is this place?" "Oh, we couldn't go there," Costa said hastily. "Why not? It's public property, isn't it?" "Yeah, but he says it's kapu e make, as far as he's concerned, whatever the hell that means. Forbidden territory, sacred. Nobody can go there except on pain of death, the way the old legends have it. Except Kilipalaki himself, of course. Him being the kaku, that's the guardian. Say, you don't mean to sit there and tell me—" "Oh, not me. As far as I'm concerned, it's just a lot of baloney. I got no more use for that stuff than you have. But if we ever went out there and found this place and went into it, this baby would take us to pieces afterward. Maybe, if he found out about it. He only goes there once every 10 days or so himself. The job won't take us that long." "I know, but—" Dave Costa wet his lips. In most matters he was no coward, but this was something different. Costa was a native of Oahu, which didn't mean that he was a Hawaiian, although there was Hawaiian in him. If it came to that, there was a little of almost everything in him. He was an 1/8 American, 1/8 Chinese, an 1/8 Portuguese, an 1/8 Puerto Rican, and so on. They get mixtures like that in the islands. "Cut it out," snarled Dane. "Look, we gotta get out of this place, don't we, before somebody finds out who I am. We gotta have money to do it with, right? Well, here's a stunt all boxed, and the only thing we need is a good hideaway. And so how about it?" He rose, finishing his drink. "There's plenty of moon and the water's quiet. Let's go out and have a gander at the place." Costa rose, too, though not enthusiastically, and they went outside. Kilipalaki was stretched on the warm grass, face down, dressed in ragged swimming trunks, which was all he ever wore. He was a magnificent figure, lying there in the moonlight. His long, thick arms and legs starfished in 4 directions, and muscle ships hawsers stood out on his shoulders and back. If he ever found out, he's good for 3-4 hours, at least. And even if he did find out, what'd he do about it? "Well, I'm pretty good, Ed, but I swear this baby could rip me apart with just his hands, and you too at the same time." Ed Dane slipped a large blue automatic from under his coat, twirled it twice by its trigger guard, and holstered it again. Who's talking about bare hands? Come on. By the time they returned, both the sun and Kilipalaki had risen. The sun with much greater confidence and far less effort than the fisherman, who was standing there in the middle of the lawn, pain in his grave dark eyes, his hands pressed against his temples, and grinning feebly at the sight of Dane and Costa. "Just taking a little early morning stroll," Dave Costa said hastily. He did not believe the fisherman had seen them get out of the boat. "You feel all right, pal?" "You knew last night." The grin faded. The fisherman stared earnestly at Dane, then at Costa. "Inu. Talk a lot." He closed his eyes, shook his head, opened his eyes again. "Talk a lot last night." "I'll say you did," Costa agreed. But neither of us could make out what you were saying." "I not talk?" Kalapaliku asked. "About Maku Manu?" "That's that little island off Makapu, isn't it?" "No, you didn't say anything about it. Why?" The fisherman did not seem convinced. His eyes, ordinarily so mild, hardened and grew small. He leaned forward. "You sure?" he asked. Ed Dane's right hand was under his coat. He didn't move. Dave Costa glowed, blustered. "Of course I'm sure. What do you mean, am I sure?" Kalapalaki sighed. His big, Polynesian eyes became soft again. He raised his hands to his aching head. "Okay," he murmured apologetically. "Me sorry. Too much okolehu last night. Oi, oi, me go mow some more." He walked to his hut, moving steadily, if sadly, still very dignified. He went inside. Ed Dane took his hand out from under his coat. "That fathead," said Dane, "probably never owned a $5 bill in his life. But he's going to make us rich, kid. He's going to make us rich." I still don't like it," said Dave Costa. "I wish we'd picked another place." Chapter 2. In 1820, missionaries from Massachusetts brought to the Hawaiian Islands the word of God and the Yankees' bargaining ability, and both of them prevailed. That is, the natives became Christians while the visitors became millionaires. Today's descendants of those first missionaries own the islands, lock, stock, and barrel, which is to say sugar land, pineapple land, the utilities, the hotels, the steamship lines, and just about everything else worth having. Among the richest of them, perhaps the very richest, are the Chisholms. Rush Chisholm, its Shion, was 23 years old and a Harvard graduate. The Chisholm line is a sturdy one, and despite the several generations between the Reverend Josiah Chisholm, who had rounded the Horn to make thousands of converts and millions of dollars, and his great-grandson, there was nothing effete about young Rush. He was a sportsman, but he didn't go in for polo, and he thought golf was too tame to be any fun. Football he had enjoyed, and flying amused him, but his real interest lay in yanking things out of the Pacific, things like uluhu and ono, and mahi-mahi and melolo. Possibly it was in his blood. The Reverend Josiah had hailed from New Bedford, Massachusetts, in the days when New Bedford was essentially a fishing town. Or possibly Rush had absorbed it from the Hawaiians themselves. Anyway, he would rather land a marlin than own New York. His idea of pure joy was to sit in his bucky little sampan Princess Kamakaiho Paiko Waikiu Konalani off the cliffs of Molokai at dawn and see how they were running. Rush was in the Princess K one morning at about 2 o'clock, some 3 weeks after the night Kalapalaki got drunk, when the cruiser appeared. The cruiser was dark, and Rush and his friend, Georgie Holmes, heard it some minutes before it loomed to starboard, dimly white in the darkness. There was no moon. "Hey," cried Georgie Holmes, "don't you fellows carry any lights?" There was no answer. The cruiser turned, its engines died. It drifted close to the sampan. A grappling hook was thrown, and the two boats ground to gunwales. Rush Chisholm went forward, puzzled. "You in trouble?" he asked. "What's the matter?" 2 men climbed from the cruiser to the sampan, and when Rush saw that they were masked and carried pistols, his first impulse was to laugh. "Say, this isn't Halloween." One of the men snapped the safety catch off his pistol, a large blue automatic, and said quietly, "Turn around and get your hands up." "You're crazy, man. Why, we haven't got the price of a pack of cigarettes here. Why, if you... I said turn around. Rush turned, then, raising his hands. And as he did so, he saw Georgie Holmes do the same. "They're absolutely nuts," Rush whispered. "Must be a couple of kids who've been reading too many gangster stories. Why, if they..." Something hit him in the back of the head, and the princess, "Kamaikaya Pakai Waikayu Kalani," suddenly seemed to have struck wild weather. Rush fell to his hands and knees. He stayed there a moment, stunned, shaking his head. He felt something dry and not too tasty being stuffed into his mouth. He tried to get up, but he got clouded again. The next thing he knew, he was being carried into the cruiser. His ankles were tied together, and his wrists were tied behind his back. They threw him on the afterdeck. Through a roaring blue, he heard them talking. "What about the other guy?" "You know, what about the other guy? That anchor's plenty heavy enough. Come on." Rush Chisholm, prone on the cruiser's deck, couldn't see what they did after that, but he could hear them, and it was horrible to listen to. Whether because he had been gagged or because he was unconscious, Georgie Holmes made never a sound, though when he hit the water the splash was very loud. By that time Rush Chisholm was fighting to free himself. Sweat rolled in hot steams down his face. His chest was pounding, his ears hummed. He was still struggling when he saw them coming back. He didn't quite down until they had kicked him 5 or 6 times on the side of the head. He tried to notice everything, tried to remember things. The two men seemed to get tired of wearing their masks, so one of them bound a handkerchief around Rush's eyes. He could hear the engine start, could feel the cruiser moving away. He ought to go boom any second now, and an instant later he heard an explosion astern. Even though the handkerchief, he could see light flare in the eye. And he knew, as he lay there in blind, baffled rage, that his sampan, the gallant little craft in which he had enjoyed so many hours of fishing, was a wreck. He tried to note and remember things for future use. His rage was with him still, but it was cold now, not hot. He hadn't the slightest doubt that Georgie Holmes was dead, slaughtered with never a chance to fight, and he told himself slowly, pronouncing each syllable of the oath in his mind, that he would accept any humiliation, pay any ransom, work any number of weeks or months or years if he had to avenge that death. He was reasonably sure that there were only 2 men, and though they spoke very seldom and in low voices, he believed that he might be able to identify these voices afterward, if he ever got the chance. He knew marine engines, and he was familiar with these waters. He estimated from the sound of this engine and from the wind on his cheek that they had gone some 20 miles, possibly a little more, and that they were somewhere off the north coast of Oahu. And finally they came to a halt. One of the bays, probably, since the water was quiet. Waimanalo? Kailu? Kaniho? The cruiser, judging from the sounds, was painted to a buoy. Rush himself was lifted out, not struggling now, and deposited on the bottom of what seemed a tiny tender. Soon he heard the squeal of oarlocks. The going was not rough at first, but after 15 or 20 minutes the boat began to pitch and toss. They had passed through the opening of some reef, he calculated, and were in the open ocean again. This lasted for some time, possibly 2 hours. Then one of the men whispered, "Take it easy now. If we capsize, it's going to be no cinch." It seemed to Rush for an instant that they had capsized. They lurched high, teetered dizzily, plunged. They rocked to one side. The keel grated sand, and water splashed over Rush. He was hauled out, his knees and feet slithering across wet sand and bumping rocky, knife-like outjuttings of coral. Then a rope was fastened underneath his armpits. A low voice said in his ear, "We're going to leave you here a few minutes, buddy. The only place you can go is into the ocean. Catch on?" Nevertheless, as soon as he heard them walk away, he rolled this way and that, tentatively, and learned nothing except that he had apparently been told the truth. Ocean on one side of him, breakers, and on the other 3 sides, sheer rock. It might have been rock he could climb over, as the men seemed to have done, but certainly, trussed as he was, he could not roll over it. The rope under his arms brought this exploration to a sudden and painful stop. It was jerked from above, tightened. It began to raise him. He felt his shoulders leave the ground, then his knees, then his feet. He dangled surf and jagged rocks, as he knew, below him. But what was above, he could not guess. Up, up, up. He swung back and forth, helpless in the breeze. He turned around and around. His face scraped the side of a cliff. His hips scraped, his right shoulder, then his left. He kept on going, up and up. Chapter 3. Lieutenant Mellet, who was no fool, leaned over the great table and placed both palms firmly upon it. Now let's get this straight. I understand exactly how you feel. You're afraid that if you report this matter, your son will be killed. You've been told that, haven't you? Donald Howard Chisholm shook his head. He was sunk down in a chair, exhausted. There were tears in his eyes, and he was not ashamed of them. Possibly he was not even conscious of them. I swear to you, Lieutenant, he whispered, that I have not received any sort of ransom note. I would like nothing better than to think my boy is still alive, even though he might be in the hands of kidnappers. He raised the wet eyes, and there was some faint glimmer of hope in them. Why is it, please tell me this, Lieutenant, why is it you're so persistent in believing that Rush has not been killed? You be honest with me, and I'll be honest with you. But I tell you, I have been honest with you. Lieutenant Mellet looked down at the older man for a long while. Then abruptly he nodded. All right, I believe you. Well, there are several reasons why we don't think a real accident occurred. One of them is that your son is an expert boatman, and he probably knew as much as any man on the islands about marine engines, and the same thing could be said for George Holmes. There was nothing particularly tricky about the engine in that old sampan. Then why all of a sudden should they have an explosion? I don't know. But there certainly was an explosion. They found parts of the boat. Yes, and if parts of the boat floated ashore, why didn't the bodies? We've been searching those waters for more than 24 hours without finding anything but wreckage. Never part of a body or even a scrap of clothing. Doesn't that strike you as funny? Well, and the most important reason of all is this. The explosion occurred at about 2:15 in the morning, as we know from that fishing party that was only a couple of miles away at the time. All right. Now I just learned, before leaving headquarters, that another fishing party is turned up to testify that they saw your son and George Holmes at about 1:45. That was about, say, a half hour before the explosion. The princess, whatever it is, hailed them and your son, whom these men know by sight, asked them if they could spare some gasoline. The sampan was under full sail and in no distress. The sea wasn't bad, but she'd run out of gas. It seems your son has forgotten to fill the tank before he left. He didn't really need the gas, he said, but he'd like to have some just to be on the safe side. Your son asked if he couldn't buy some from them, but they said they were short of it themselves. That wouldn't have disconcerted Rush, Chisholm interposed. He seldom used the auxiliary engine, anyway. He was a crack sailor. I know that, but get this part straight. At 1:45 they didn't have gas. At 2:15 the boat exploded. Oh, exactly. That wasn't any accident, that explosion. Somebody put a bomb in that boat deliberately, probably after taking your son and George Holmes off, just to make people think both of them had been drowned. Then, after a vain search for their bodies, the matter would be dropped, and the kidnappers can get in touch with you. I hope that you're right, Lieutenant. I certainly hope so. If I am right, Mr. Chisholm, and if you do get a ransom note, will you tell us? Donald Howard Chisholm stared somberly at his hands folded in front of him on the table. He stared at them for a long while. I don't know, Lieutenant, he whispered at last. I don't know whether I would or not. That's the best I can tell you. Lieutenant Mellet was thoughtful as he returned to his car. For a minute he just sat there, his car parked in the drive. Dynamite, he knew, wouldn't move Donald Howard Chisholm from any decision once he'd made it. And Chisholm worshipped that son of his only child. Rush's mother had been dead for 6 years. A taxi drew up at the veranda of the Chisholm house, and a lad in ducks, Japanese sandals, and a dirty blue shirt tumbled out. In his hands he held a hollow glass object, football-shaped, about 8 inches long. There was a solid glass knot at one end. "Hello, Akani," Lieutenant Mellet said, getting out of his car. Akani was not pleased. He was a furtive young rascal, a beach hanger-on, A would-be tough, part Hawaiian, part Korean. He had once served a term at Wiley for sneak thievery. You're getting Tony these days, calling on the Chisholms in a taxi, too. I didn't do nothing, Connie said sulkily. I didn't say you did. What are you here for? I don't have to tell you what I come here for. No, you don't, Mellett said quietly. If you prefer to get a few of your front teeth knocked out. He meant that. He didn't have any charge against Connie, but he had a hunch, and Mellett usually played his hunches. Found this ball, Connie muttered. I'm taking it to Mr. Chisholm to try to sell it. I hear he collects them. Mellett took the thing from the youth's hands. Mellett knew a Japanese fishing ball when he saw one. They come in various shapes and various sizes, though they are mostly round. They are always made of glass, and always hollow. They are Japanese fishing balls, used as floats to keep up one end of a fishing net. They break loose from time to time, and they float, carried by ocean currents. They float, astoundingly, from the coast of Japan clear to the Hawaiian Islands, more than 3,000 miles away. Some are lost at sea, but a great many do get washed up on the shore. Intrinsically worthless, they make striking living room ornaments, and they have some value as souvenirs. Almost anybody who walks at Windward Island Beach early in the morning is likely to find one, though he must walk very early, before the beach combers are busy. Where'd you get this, Connie? Mokapu. I live out there now. I thought maybe Mr. Chisholm might want to buy it. So you took a taxi all the way across the island, which cost you $4, in order to ask a man to buy something not worth 50 cents? A man who's got plenty of these things already? A man who's just heard about the death of his son? The youth glowered at his feet. I got a perfect right to come and see Mr. Chisholm. Sure, Mellett handed the ball back. Go ahead and see him. I'm sure he'll be delighted. Startled, Connie took the ball and hurried up the stairs. He whispered to a servant for a moment. He was admitted. Well, I don't know what's going on, sighed Mellett, but it looks like there's only one way to find out. He went up the steps, crossed the veranda, let himself in without ringing the bell. A servant approached him in the entrance hall, but Mellett brushed him aside and went right to the library door. He didn't knock. Chisholm was leaning on the library table. Opposite him, Connie was taking something out of a small rubber bag. There was a string on the bag, a broken string, and there was a broken string too, Mellett now noted, on the neck of the Japanese fishing ball. The men looked up. Mellett did not hesitate. He crossed the room, snatched the bag and its contents from Connie. He found himself holding a square, white, carefully sealed envelope, stained with a few drops of brine, but otherwise dry. On the outside was typed, Finder, take this to D.H. Chisholm, Pacific Heights, without opening it and without telling anybody, and you will receive a reward. Mellett read it, then looked at Connie. This was tied to the ball? Yes. You got nothing on me. All I did was... He glanced up, saw the look in Mellett's eyes, and realizing that this was a much more important matter than he had supposed, cringed. Absolutely, Lieutenant. I don't know anything more about it. Absolutely, I don't. Donald Howard Chisholm said quietly, Give me that letter. Mellett said, I don't think I shall, Mr. Chisholm. This is my house, and that letter is addressed to me. I know that, but I think this is a police matter. Suppose I went around the table and took it away from you. I don't think you'd try that, Mr. Chisholm. There was a taut, brief silence. Lieutenant Mellett was well set up, in perfect physical condition, and not quite half the millionaire's age. He didn't stir. You know, Lieutenant, that if I wanted to, I could have you thrown off the force. I don't know whether you could do that, but you could sure make me a lot of trouble, Mellett admitted soberly. Well, I'm not threatening. This matter is a lot more important to me than that. Without taking his gaze from Mellett's face, he opened a drawer in the table and took out a small, shiny revolver. He didn't point it at Mellett, simply held it in the palm of his hand. My only threat is this, and I mean it. If you open that letter, and if because you have opened that letter, my son is killed by kidnappers, then I'll go to wherever you are and shoot you through the heart. I mean that. Mellett nodded slowly. Yes, I know you mean it. Connie stood, goggle-eyed. Scared speechless, Mellet still did not stir. "Are you going to open that letter?" "Yes, Mr. Chisholm, I'm going to open this letter." He did. The message on a single sheet of plain white paper was typewritten. "We have your son alive. We can produce good evidence of this at the proper time and place. Get $75,000 in 5s, 10s, and 20s, all old ones, not marked. Have it ready. You will hear from us again soon. If you notify the police or anybody else at all, your son will be instantly killed." There was no signature. Mellet read it twice, the second time aloud. Then he folded it as it had been folded, and put it into a pocket. Chisholm asked, "Will there be an alarm?" "Yes," said Mellet. "We'll work as quietly as we can, but it simply won't be possible to keep it under cover very long." Chisholm joggled his hand, making the pistol move. "I suppose you're a better judge of these things than I am, Lieutenant. You should be, but remember what I said." "I'll remember, don't worry," Mellet said grimly. Then he turned to Akani. "You. Makapuu, you said." "Come on." Donald Howard Chisholm was still standing there with the pistol in his hand when they went out. Lieutenant Mellet, who was no fool, stood spread-legged on the beach and stared at the distant brown mass of Makumanu, Bird Island. It was about half a mile off the end of Maku Point, and loomed like a chipped-off chunk of the extinct volcanic crater of Ulapa, which occupied most of the point. Makumanu had been searched. Indeed, every place for hundreds of miles around had been, or was being searched. For the past 4 days, the police of Oahu, Molokai, and the other islands, with the assistance of Army and Navy flyers, had been seeking Russ Chisholm or his body. The flyers had even gone as far as Necker Island and the numerous reefs and shoals in the direction of Midway. Officially nothing had been said about kidnapping, and the papers had not carried so much as a rumor to this effect. Officially it was a search for the body, continued in the faint hope that young Chisholm and George Holmes might have clung to a piece of wreckage and been washed out to sea or cast ashore on one of the small, faraway, deserted islands of the leeward group. In actual fact, however, most of the searchers knew what they really were looking for. 100 clues had been traced down. Nothing had been found. The search had started at Makapuu Beach, the other side of the point from where Lieutenant Mellet stood at Kailua. It was on Makapuu Beach that the ransom note had been found. Police investigators differed in their theories. Some thought that the message really had washed ashore and that it was one of a number of such messages thrown into the ocean from a kidnapper's hideout on one of the leeward islands. The others, according to this idea, had been lost at sea. The answer to this was that it would be extremely difficult for any group of men, however small and well prepared, to hide on those islands, which were bare and uninhabited. It had also been suggested that the glass ball had in fact been placed on the beach, on the assumption that it would be picked up by the first person who saw it, and that he, or she, would do what Akani had tried to do, take it immediately to Mr. Chisholm. This would mean that the kidnappers were far from any place from which the ball could float ashore at Makapuu. In other words, the ball was a blind, a false lead, and the kidnappers were really somewhere on the south shore of Oahu, perhaps in the city of Honolulu or Waikiki. They couldn't both be right, and Lieutenant Mellet believed that they were both wrong. He believed that the kidnappers had a real hideaway somewhere around Makapuu Beach, and that they had counted upon the police figuring that the glass ball was meant to be a blind. However, this entire neighborhood had been thoroughly searched. Even little Makumanu, which rose, mostly sheer cliff, about 75 feet out of the water. It is true that nobody had landed on Makumanu, but this had been considered necessary. Planes had flown over it, and several parties had encircled it in powerboats, examining the small caves on the leeward side. It would be difficult to land either a powerboat or a sailboat there, since the only beach, tiny even at low tide, was on the windward shore, and was studded with pinnacles of rock. Nevertheless, Lieutenant Mellet decided to have a better look at Makumanu. He went back to the general store and post office and asked who could take him out there. Old Kalapalaki, he was told, would be the best man for the job. There was also a kid named Ed Hupono,
But Kalapalaki's the one. He goes out there himself every 10 days or so. Knows that little beach like he knows his own hand. Goes out there fishing? No. I don't know what he goes for, but he never brings back any fish. But Kalapalaki shook his head when Mellet made him an offer. No, not for $2, not for $3, not even for $5. What did the lieutenant want to go out to that place for? Kalapalaki, ordinarily the most genial of men, was sullen, suspicious. Ed Hupunu was utterly different. A grinning, boisterous, wise-cracking youngster. He would have gone to Makumanu for nothing at all, if asked in the right way. He readily agreed to go for $2. Sure, hop in, nothing to it. Huponu had never landed there, but he did not question his ability to do so. He sang as he paddled, and told dirty stories. He thought he was a very bright lad, Huponu. He ought to have been at Wakaiki entertaining tourists. Mellet didn't like him, but he was an expert canoeist, and strong as an ox. He landed the little boat perfectly. To right and left the cliffs were sheer, but there was a place directly in front where it was possible to climb. Mellet paused at the top, panting. Then suddenly he ceased to pant, started instead to sniff. He turned and looked sharply at Huponu, who, having stopped to beach the canoe, was a few steps behind. Have you been smoking a cigarette? Huponu thought that this was very funny. He thought everything was funny. That Kanaka. He laughed loudly. No, he hadn't been smoking. Somebody has, Mellet declared solemnly. He was a smoker himself, but he had not had a cigarette for more than an hour now. His nostrils had caught only the faintest whiff of smoke, but even that was odd out on this bleak island. Presently he could not smell any at all. A clean, warm northeast wind swept the top of the islet. It was a flat place, liver-shaped, perhaps 200 by 100 yards, containing some loose sandy earth, some scrubby grass, and a multitude of curiously fashioned volcanic rocks. There was no evidence that any human being had ever been there. Mellet searched thoroughly. It didn't take long, but he found no cigarette and no place where a man could possibly hide. What are you looking for? Hupunu asked tolerantly. I don't know, Mellet confessed. He walked around, examined the earth and grass. Now and then moved one of the smaller rocks. It was possible, he reflected, that there might be a lava tube here somewhere. Lava tubes are formations sometimes found on the slopes or at the base of an extinct volcano. They are made when the volcano is active, by huge gas bubbles forcing their way up through hot, hardening lava that stiffens around them, creating a sort of tube or tunnel which may be as small as a rat hole or as big as a Roman catacomb. Mostly lava tubes are under the surface of the earth, their mouths blocked with dirt and stone. Mellet stamped his feet. Hupunu watched him with a grin, convinced, no doubt, that the man was crazy. It might be hollow here, or it might not. It sounded hollow, but so did most volcanic land, and Mellet was no geologist. Seen enough? Asked Hupunu. No, said Mellet. Somebody was smoking a cigarette up here, or just underneath here. I don't know who it was or where he's hiding, but before I leave this dump, I'm going to find out. He peeled off his coat. Come on, you. Let's see what we can do about rolling back some of these big fellows. It all seemed very silly to Ed Hupunu, but he didn't have anything else to do, and he was a fine, healthy young animal who actually enjoyed violent physical exertion. Between them they moved a dozen or more rocks and found nothing. Then they faced the biggest of the lot, a boulder as tall as themselves. We'll never budge that. We can try, said Mellet. Maybe it's not as firm as it looks. It took some time, for the rock was enormous, and sweat rolled down the bodies of the two men while they strained. Yet the rock moved finally, and once it had started to move, the rest was easy. It toppled to its side, exposing a circular opening about 3 feet in diameter. Mellet said, Oh, and drew a flashlight. The beam disclosed a gently sloping tunnel. Well, I'm going in. Want to come? What's the matter? You think I'm afraid? They had to go in on hands and knees at first, Mellet in advance and carrying a flash. But the tube grew larger as they proceeded, and soon they were able to stand up. The walls and ceiling were rough but dry. The floor was worn smooth, as though many persons had gone back and forth across it. When they rose, they paused a moment, and Mellet moved his light around. It was then that they first heard the sound. It came from the blackness ahead. A deep, low sucking noise, gurgling like a ghoulish sigh. It rose and roared, then fell back, sobbing. And then there was silence. What's that? Take it easy, Hupunu. It's probably nothing but some kind of underground water cave. Some kind of a blowhole, maybe. They listened for half a minute, but they did not hear the sound again. They started ahead, moving slowly and silently with little steps. The tunnel turned, and they found themselves in a chamber possibly 8 feet high and almost as broad. The first thing Mellet saw there, he almost stumbled over it, was the rowboat. It was a tiny boat, dry, with 2 oars as long as the craft itself, and 2 oarlocks. It was so small and light that 2 men could have carried it, and in fact could have even dragged it into this lava tube for concealment. It was empty except for the oars and oarlocks. Something grasped Mellet's right elbow, jarring the flashlight. "Look!" Hupunu was whispering. "What's that?" The thing was almost at their feet. It was very old, but made of some very hard wood. A long dagger, or a short sword, perhaps 28 inches from tip to tip, and it would have once been its edge were set yellowed shark's teeth. "Pahi," Hupunu whispered. "Ancient sword for Ali Nui, for great chief. Maybe this is a burial place." "Well, maybe it is," Mellet whispered angrily. "The thing certainly looks like a museum piece, and I know they used to bury the old-timers with their weapons. But I never heard of any of them having been buried with a rowboat." "Burial place is sacred," Hupunu whispered. Outside in the open air, he would have laughed at any talk of the old beliefs. He was, ostensibly, and proud of it, a thoroughly Americanized wisecracker, a gum-chewer, who read and thought he understood the Walter Winchell column syndicated in one of the Honolulu papers. It had been 100 years since his ancestors had for all time overthrown their idols and denounced their tribal gods, sneering at Pele of the Fire Mountain, laughing in derision at Kane, Kanaloa, Ku, Lono. But the old beliefs die hard. "Look!" He pointed to a piece of rotting tapa cloth, hanging like a flag at the end of a small fishing spear stuck in a fissure. "Kapu e meke." The word is taboo, or taboo, in southern Polynesian dialects, but kapu in Hawaiian, which has no T or B. In everyday life, on a sign, it means merely keep out or no trespassing. But on a flag in a secret cave which might be a king's burial place, it could mean, as Hupunu had whispered, "Kapu I meke," death to him who passes. "All right," said Mellet. "You still can't tell me that it was some ancient king who pulled this rowboat in here, and who was smoking a cigarette a little while ago. Clear out, if you're afraid." "I'll stay. I'm not afraid." His fright made his voice choky. "But if an Ali Nui was buried here, he might come up and grab us. He might come up and Mamu and Mahoi." "Listen," snarled Mellet. "Either cut out that talk or go back. I'm going on. Why, if we did find a Mamu in here, we'd be rich. You know how much those things are worth? Why, if we—" Punu screamed. He had been standing right at Mellet's elbow, and in that small place the scream was ear-splitting. Mellet had moved his arm a little, raising the flashlight. Now he looked in that direction, gasping. Hundreds of generations of ancestors who'd believed in the vengeful gods of these regions and in the power of long-buried kings to raise themselves from the dead did not weigh on Mellet's soul or numb his brain. Yet even Mellet, when he saw what the flashlight revealed, thought for a terrible instant that he would swoon. At the far end of the chamber, perhaps 10 feet away, was a doorway, which apparently led to another and similar chamber. In this doorway stood what at first glance seemed a man at least 7 feet tall and appallingly thin. On his hand he wore a royal war helmet, a mehoi, covered with feathers of the iwi bird, thousands of them, brilliantly red. The helmet was low, and no face was visible. Around the neck was a niho paloho, such as had not been worn by any man since the days at Kalani. A battle charm containing 1 large and 2 small whale teeth. The body was draped in a long and splendid mamo, or ancient feathered cape, red and yellow. The legs beneath this were supernaturally thin. looking like blackened bones, and there were no feet. Even in that hideous instant of fright, Mellet was struck by the dazzling splendor of the mamo in the headdress. There could be no doubt that they were genuine, and that the mamu in particular was a thing beyond price. For many generations it had been impossible for men to counterfeit these extraordinary garments. Not only had the art been lost, the birds themselves, the tiny uwihu and ula and o, had long been extinct. 30, 40, 50 years, and the patient labor of dozens of slaves had gone into the manufacture of that royal cape, the mamu. Each bird, carefully caught, contributed but 2 tiny feathers, one from under each wing. Yet there must have been 500,000 feathers in the cape. It fairly crashed with brilliance in the light Mellet held upon it. Ed Hupunu, the know-it-all, recovered the use of his muscles, if not of his mind. Mellet heard him run back, drop to his knees where the tunnel narrowed, and scramble wildly for the daylight. It was no man that stood there in the doorway, and no ghost either. Mellet saw this as soon as he was able to gather his agitated thoughts, and accustom his eyes to the splendor of the mamu. No, it was no man. It was not even intended to serve as a glorious scarecrow, though this had been its effect. Here was a true mamu, true maihoi, true niku palau, thrown over the top of a couple of lawn poles, possibly old spears or processional kahais, propped carefully in the doorway. Mellet took a step toward it, but he did not touch it. Behind him he heard Hupunu scrambling up the tunnel toward the opening. Hupunu, the fool, would race away in the canoe. He was panic-stricken. He would not stop until he reached the shore of Kailu Beach, and possibly not then, which would leave Mellet alone on the island. Or was he alone? After all, there was the presence of that rowboat to be explained, and there was also the fact that he had sniffed cigarette smoke. He turned and ran after Hupunu. At the entrance of the lava tube he saw the Kanaka stumbling and tumbling down the hillside. He shouted, but Hupunu did not seem to hear. He remembered afterward that he heard a slight pain at his side as he opened his mouth to shout again, but he thought nothing of it at the time. Hupunu, about 2/3 of the way down the steep slope, suddenly pitched forward like an acrobat. He turned 2 complete somersaults and landed on the sand of the beach, motionless. Probably sprained his ankle, Mellet muttered. He descended hastily but carefully. It was a dangerous path at best. He found Hupunu lying on his back, arms outstretched, his eyes wide open but seeing nothing. Mellet shook him, slapped his face. "Pull yourself together. You're all right," he said loudly, but Hupunu was not all right. As Mellet discovered when he lifted the head, there was blood on Mellet's hand when he drew it away from Hupunu's nape. He turned the Kanaka over. There was a small blue hole in the back of the head. It is from this that the blood came. Hupunu was dead. "All right, buddy. Just hold it." On the edge of the cliff above were 2 men. One held a rifle at the end of which was screwed a long, shiny silencer. The other, younger and huskier, held 2 revolvers. "You let us take care of that stiff, buddy. What you do is climb back up here, and one try for your gat makes you dead." Chapter 5. Mellet, when they threw him on the stone floor, caught only a glimpse of the other man. Mellet was bound hand and foot, and so was the other. The kidnappers went out, taking their kerosene lantern with them, leaving the chamber pitchy dark. There was a moment of silence. Then, almost at Mellet's elbow, rose a low, sucking sigh. It became very loud, almost a roar. It died, sobbing convulsively. A voice said, very quietly, very casually, "And who the hell are you?" Mellet started to roll in that direction, but the voice said hurriedly, "Take it easy. Too far over that way would be the last thing you ever knew. It drops away into a sort of slit there, about 2 feet wide, and God knows how deep. The sea comes up into it every now and then, and there are hidden caves underneath." "What sort of guessed that?" Mellet muttered. "A lovely sound. You get used to it." They both fell silent. The place was dry, but utterly dark. Only every 7 or 8 minutes did the sea lift itself with that agonized sigh into the subterranean chasm. And from the sound, it never came nearer than within a few yards of where Malit lay. You haven't answered my question yet, the voice said again. Excuse it, please, Malit said bitterly. I'm Lieutenant Malit of the police department of the city and county of Honolulu. Does that satisfy you? No, indeed. I'd still like to know what my chances are of getting out of this hole alive, though I don't suppose you have anything to say about it now. You're Rush Chisholm. Yes, I'm Rush Chisholm. I've been here 5 days, and I'm getting pretty tired of it. And the first person who breezes along to relieve the monotony turns out to be a cop. Only he's in as bad a spot as I am. Did you come alone, Lieutenant? Practically. If you knew I was here, why didn't you bring a whole squad? I didn't know you were here. I just had a hunch. Was it you who let out that scream? You wouldn't let me yell They wouldn't let me yell a warning. When we heard you coming, they were holding my mouth. No, I didn't scream. My friend did. What happened to him? He's dead now. What happened to your friend, by the way? He's dead now, too, Russ Chisholm said, and there was no light, bantering note in his voice now. Well, Malik could almost hear the man swallow. Well, let's not start weeping. Does anybody know you're out here? No. I was playing a hunch of my own, you see. I was desperate. It happened that a certain man told me he'd kill me in cold blood if I didn't get you back safe. Well, you'll probably never get the chance. Is there really a big search going on for me and Georgie Holmes? We've been hearing aeroplanes for the past 3 or 4 days. Yes, there's a search. I'm part of it. For our bodies? For you personally, the cops know it was a snatch. How come? These hosts of mine are under the impression that they made it look like an accident. Except that the airplanes have them worried now. A certain damn fool, explained Malik, decided that the alarm ought to be given. Chisholm Sr. or no Chisholm Sr. I'll bet the old man was sore. He was. How's he taking it? Like the swell guy that he is. After a moment, young Chisholm said, You know, Lieutenant, I'm beginning to sort of like you. Anybody who understands the old man. But I would certainly like to take a good healthy poke at the cop who insisted on a general alarm. Yes, I don't blame you, said Malik. A light came bobbing toward them. It was far away, and for a time they could not see it directly. Malik gathered that it was in the hands of somebody who was descending the lava tube. How does the cigarette smoke get out of this place? There's a fissure of some kind above where I'm lying, Russ Chisholm answered. It doesn't let any light in, and you can't feel the draught. But I've seen the smoke disappear there. Is that how you happen to find this place? My hosts never supposed anybody would land here, and they didn't know there was anything wrong until they heard you coming down. They were all set to blast you as soon as you stepped into this chamber, but evidently the sight of old Kamehameha there in the doorway sort of scared you off. The light was getting brighter. Malik, turning his head, could see the man he'd been talking to. Young Chisholm had a 5-day growth of beard on chin and cheeks. He lay motionless, but he smiled amiably at Malik. A few feet away on Chisholm's left was the doorway leading to the other chamber. In that doorway stood the glorious scarecrow who Puna had taken for the ghost of a long-departed king. That figure was clear now, with the approaching light behind it. From the back, it did not look at all like a human being. It looked like what it was, a priceless cape thrown over a couple of poles. Malik said, Kamehameha, eh? Well, my friend thought he really was. And no wonder. Do you know that's a real Mamo there? Sure I know it. I've been trying to talk my charming host into understanding that they've stumbled upon a genuine treasure trove, but they don't believe me. Why, that Mamo's worth more than I am. And if you'll look around, you'll see plenty of ancient weapons to go with it. And over in a corner behind me there's a pile of bones that probably once were the big chief himself. A burial place. A secret burial place. What's more, it's been kept up. Those bones were nicely arranged and perfectly clean, until our gunman friends pushed them into a heap to make more room. The weapons were well polished, and the mamu and helmet are in perfect condition. That's a couple of real kahilis they're resting on, incidentally. Somebody's been faithful. Some oldest son of an oldest son of an oldest son of the man who supervised the burial in the first place. Those Kanakas have a long memory, and this one, whoever he is, hasn't forgotten his heritage. I would say, from what I know about the old customs, that only one man in the world ought to be aware of this place, and I can't understand how these kidnappers found it. Anyway, I would hate to be in their spot if the guardian ever learns about their desecration. He'd probably some Kanaka too feeble to walk, but I'll bet he'd fight like a wildcat if he could see the way those bones had been violated. Ed Dane and Dave Costa came into the chamber then, Dane carrying the lantern. They hauled the dead body of Ed Hupunu between them. Costa was holding a handkerchief in front of his face, but Ed Dane laughed at the idea. Don't bother. If you think we're going to let either of these guys walk out of this place, you're screwy. They might just as well have a look at us, for all the good it's going to do them. Here, get this punk's legs. Not 2 feet from Elite's right elbow, as he saw now, was the chasm of which Rush Chisholm had spoken. It's a straight, sheer drop into total darkness. Even as Dane and Costa were hauling the corpse toward the edge, unseen water sighed suckingly up into it, roared in baffled rage, and sobbed itself away. Whatever goes down there, said Dane, don't ever come out again. Not any part of it, okay, Dave? They heaved, Dane at the arms, Costa at the ankles. The body of Ed Hupunu, who had thought he was such a smart guy, swung into the air and disappeared. After a long moment there was a splash. Malit bit the inside of his mouth to keep himself from yelling out. Presently there came again that rising scream of water, that roar, that fading, dying, weeping recession. Hupunu would never come to the surface. His body would be battered to pieces in underground caverns, denied even the buoyancy, the bittersweet saltiness of the open sunlit sea. It would disintegrate in the dark, tossed here and there, smashed and slashed to bits. Ed Dane took a badge out of his pocket and looked at it, and then he looked at Lieutenant Malit. There was no expression on his face. A cop, huh? Malit said nothing. A cop, huh? Anybody else know you're here? Still, Malit said nothing. Dane twisted down one corner of his mouth. Without taking his gaze from Malit, he jerked his head toward his partner. You ask him, Dave. Dave Costa walked deliberately to where Malit lay, and deliberately he kicked Malit 4 times in the face. Blood came into Malit's mouth and spurted from his nose. One eye was shut. A little more, Dave. There was a little more. Rush Chisholm cursed loudly in a rapid, hot, protesting stream. Malit was silent, trying to turn his head away from the kicks as much as possible. He could not move far without getting dangerously close to the edge of the chasm. He clenched his teeth. After a while, Dave Costa stopped. You're not getting anywhere by trying to be tough, Dane said sadly. Sooner or later, you're going to go after that Kanaka down there. But we could cause you a lot of misery in the meanwhile. If you don't speak your little piece, I'll ask you again. Does anybody know you came here? Malit swallowed some blood, felt a few front teeth with his tongue, swallowed some more blood, and managed to smile. It was pretty awful, but it was a smile. Why don't you go to hell? He asked. Why, you lousy? Dave Costa cried, but Dane snapped. Cut it out, Dave. We got plenty of time for that. First of all, we got to make sure that canoe is pushed far enough away so that it won't be washed back. We don't want anybody snooping around here to see what's going on. After it gets dark, we can lamb in our own little tub. That is, when these guys are put away. Stay here and watch them while I take a look around. He went out. Rush Chisholm began to talk to Costa, whom he had figured as the weaker of the 2 kidnappers. So you're trying to be a big tough boy and get into the snatch racket with a mainlander, eh? Why, you poor fool. Can't you see that man's just taking you for a runaround? Suppose you keep your trap shut, Costa growled. Nice mess you've made of it already, haven't you? You've killed 2 men and you're planning to kill 2 more before you leave here. Though what's that going to get you? What about the ransom? Costa kicked him in the right ear. Shut up, I said. Chisholm colored to the roots of his hair, and his eyes hardened. But he did not stir. He only said quietly, changing his tactics, So you've got no use for the old idea that a king's burial place ought to be sacred? Some Kahu's been keeping this. You can tell that from the way the bones were arranged and the way the weapons and clothes were laid out. He ought to be the only man in the world who knows about this place. Dave Costa grinned nervously. He used to be, but he got tight one night and told me. Well, all I can say is I'd hate to be you if he decides to come out here for another inspection trip. He won't, Costa said confidently. He ain't due for a couple of days yet, and by that time Ed and I will be miles away. What if he happened to see the lieutenant and his friend make their landing, or heard that they were coming out here? What if he got suspicious and decided to come have a look? He couldn't if he wanted to. Ed and I rowed ashore last night and swiped his canoe, knocked the outrigger off, stove holes in the bottom, and filled it full of rocks and sunk it. He could swim. Outside the reef, in water full of sharks and barracuda. Nevertheless, it was apparent that Dave Costa was troubled not only by the fact that there was an extensive search in progress, but also by the fact that he was in Kapue Maki territory. He could and did scoff at the old beliefs, but after all he was 1/8 Hawaiian. Even as he talked, his eyes flicked uneasily toward the gorgeous scarecrow. Even Dane was not crammed with confidence. 5 days in, this gloomy place had made him about twice as irritable as he ordinarily was. As he came from the outer chamber, his shoulder struck one of the kalihis. Impetuously he slapped down the whole rickety scarecrow. Does that damn thing have to be there all the time? He shouted. The Mahiuli rolled almost to the edge of the chasm while Malit and Chisholm held their breaths. Then it stopped. Below, water rose, roared, sobbed away. Everything looks all right, Dane reported. He was staring at Malit. But I still don't like the idea of this guy busting in on us. They might miss him and find out that he came here. We can't take any chances. It'll be a couple of hours before it gets dark, but it'll take us most of that time to carry the rowboat down to the beach. So I'd think we better put those babies away without any further fooling around. Chisholm asked quickly. And give up the ransom? Who said anything about giving up the ransom? We can take your coat and that seal ring and you got on and a few other things like that, and we'll fix up some different way of showing them to your old man. He won't know you're dead, and when he sees those things, he won't dare take the chance. He'll pay all right. Yes, he'll pay, Russ Chisholm agreed quietly. But if I knew anything at all about my father, he'll devote the rest of his life, if necessary, to catching the men who killed me. Let him. How's he going to get anywhere? We'll toss you and this cop here into the drink below. And how's anybody ever going to find any trace of you after that? We'll clean things up here and fix them the way they were. Haul our rowboat outside, push the rock back into place over the entrance, and even that big Kanaka, when he comes for another visit, won't know anything's happened. Come on, Dave, the cop first. He's nearest. Costa's face was white, and his hands trembled. The prospect of this killing was difficult to face. George Holmes had been unconscious, and Ed Hupunu had been dead. But the cop was alive, staring at him. He was breathing and moving a little. Costa, however, was even more afraid of his gray-eyed partner, who stared coldly at him now. Well, what's biting you? Grab his feet. Costa obeyed. Lieutenant Malit struggled, but there wasn't much he could do. He kicked with his legs. He flayed up and down with his arms to try to keep Dane from grabbing them. But the bonds held, and in half a minute the two men had him off the ground. He heard Chisholm cursing them. He heard the water in that inky chasm rise again, gurgling ghoulishly, and he heard it subside. 1, 2. His legs were dropped. He heard Ed Dane snarl a curse, and he saw Dave Costa standing there with wild fright in his eyes. Ed, look! Dane's grip on Malit's wrists was released. Malit rolled hastily away from the edge. He twisted, raised his head. Kilpalaki stood in the doorway. Chapter 6. The fisherman was wet, not with sweat but with fresh salt water. His great body glistened in the light of the lantern as he stood there breathing heavily. His white hair shone. Most terrible of all were his eyes. Here was no good-natured, shy-speaking giant. Here was a man, stark mad with rage, made suspicious presumably by Melit's endeavor to hire him for a visit to Maku Manu. He had decided to inspect his sacred charge a few days ahead of time. He had found that his canoe was missing, but this hadn't made him change his mind. What was that stretch to a swimmer like? Kalipalaki, sharks, barracuda, they would not bite a kahu on such an errand. The spirit of the great chief, the Ali Nui, forgotten by everybody except the man who had inherited the responsibility for his bones, would stave off sharks and barracuda. He had found the entrance rock rolled aside. He had heard voices, seen a light in the sacred chamber, and now, panting, his eyes ablaze with fanatical fury, he saw what had happened to the objects he and his father and his grandfather and so many of his paternal ancestors had kept so scrupulously for many generations. Whether he recognized Costa and Dane as the two men who had plied him with liquor that night several weeks ago was impossible to tell, and it was not important. He saw them, and he was going to kill them. His eyes told that. Shrieked it. Ka! Dave Costa took a step backward and drew his revolver. Even Ed Dane took a backward step, so that he stood close to Melit's feet. Dane's hand moved like a snake, and abruptly it held a big blue automatic. Hold it, big boy. It was like playing a harmonica in an attempt to roar down a tropical hurricane. Kalipalaki, if he even saw the pistols, certainly did not fear them. He did not fear anything. Bellowing, he sprang. Ed Dane fired twice, and the sound of the explosions in that subterranean chamber was terrific. The first bullet must surely have struck Kalipalaki, and it was a heavy pistol too, a Colt .45. But the madman never hesitated, never swerved. The second shot went wild, because Melit, in the interval, had raised both his feet and kicked Dane from behind. Dane lurched forward. One of the fisherman's swinging fists glanced against the side of his head, and it spun him around at least 3 times before he fell. He rose almost instantly, still clinging to the automatic, but he was dizzy, stunned. He started to take a step backward, lifting the gun. His foot struck a prone kalihi, which rolled under it. He staggered, waving his arms to regain his balance. He caught his other foot in the edge of the mamo, the feather cape made for the shoulders of a king. He got free of the mamo, but he never did recover his balance. Lieutenant Melit, who was watching him in the split second in which it all happened, saw him disappear over the edge of the chasm. He went as though jerked on invisible wires. His eyes were bulging half out of his head. His mouth was open, and he might have been screaming, but no scream could be heard because of the crashing echoes of the shots. Kalipalaki did not hesitate. He plunged straight on toward Costa. Costa fired at least twice, perhaps 3 times. The revolver kicked violently in his hand, but he could not possibly have missed the giant who was attacking him. Stiff with fright, he had only strength enough and presence of mind enough to squeeze the trigger. Otherwise he couldn't move. Then Kalipalaki's hands went around his throat, and the 2 men fell, Costa underneath. Neither of them moved after that. There was not even a last sigh, a death rattle. One atop the other, they lay on the lip of the abyss, utterly quiet. Thin revolence of earth, dislodged by the force of the shots, pattered down from the ceiling. Unseen water rose with a banshee-like wail, and fell back, sucking, sobbing. It was at least 2 hours later that Lieutenant Melit crawled out of the entrance to the lava tube and signaled to a fishing boat. He had freed Rush Chisholm, but Rush had been too stiff to move for at least half an hour. Dane's body, of course, was never found. They took 3 chunks of lead out of Kalipalaki. The biggest, which ballistics men said had come from a Colt .45 automatic, had smashed his breastbone, passing through one of his lungs, and after chipping his spinal column had come to rest in the muscles of the back. It should have killed him instantly, so, for the matter, should either of the others, one of which had passed directly through his heart. Yet he had lived long enough to avenge the desecration of his charge. His enormous knotty hands, even as he was dying, had snapped Dave Costa's neck, as though it had been a twig. I expect he must have been the last Kahu left, Russ Chisholm said, pouring another drink for his friend, Lieutenant Melit. His children and grandchildren are all dead. It's a great pity. He was a great boy, observed Melit. I wish I'd had a chance to know him. They were in Donald Howard Chisholm's library, and Donald Howard Chisholm was with them. However, not drinking, but only glancing at the highball in front of him with a quick, nervous smile every now and then glancing in the same manner at his son. Donald Howard Chisholm was too excited and too happy to drink. After a while, he said to Malik, "Well, I suppose I'm under arrest, Lieutenant." "Arrest? What's the matter?" "Well, threatening a policeman with a deadly weapon. You haven't forgotten what I told you when you were here before, have you? That's a serious offense, and you have a witness, too. That's a Connie." "Don't be crazy," said Malik. "I'm only glad that you didn't have to carry out that promise." "Well, so am I." Russ Chisholm had heard the story. He chuckled, reaching for his drink. He held the drink up to the light and looked at it, grinning. "Well, if it comes to that," he said, "so am I." The end.